I don't know why I'm writing this down. Maybe because it's the only way I can convince myself it actually happened. Or maybe because I need someone out there to believe me, before what happened to me happens to someone else. For years, I worked as a janitor. Not exactly a dream job, but it paid the bills. You know the type: graveyard shift, empty buildings, the hum of vending machines and fluorescent lights. The kind of silence that gets under your skin. This story takes place about 8 years ago, when I was working nights at Brookwood High School in Ohio. The school was old, built in the 1950s, with long echoing hallways and a boiler room that looked like something out of a horror movie. Most nights were uneventful: sweep, mop, empty trash, repeat. But one night, the night that ruined my life, I saw something I can't explain. The first signs. It was late October, a few days before Halloween. Perfect timing, I guess. I remember because the classrooms were still decorated with fake cobwebs, paper pumpkins, and those goofy skeleton cutouts. I clocked in at 10 p.m., same as always, and started on the second floor. The first couple of hours were normal. I plugged in my headphones, listened to a podcast, and zoned out while vacuuming. But around midnight, I noticed something strange. The history classroom door, the one that always stayed locked, was wide open. Now, here's the thing: teachers usually lock their doors before leaving. This one, room 214, was especially notorious. Mr. Grady, the history teacher, was paranoid about kids stealing test papers. I'd worked there long enough to know that if any door was going to be locked, it was his. But there it was. Open. I figured maybe he'd forgotten for once, so I stepped inside. The classroom smelled musty, like old books and chalk dust. I did a quick sweep with my flashlight. Everything seemed normal, until I noticed the chalkboard. In big, uneven letters, someone had scrawled, "Don't let him out." I froze. The handwriting didn't look like Mr. Grady's. It looked rushed, messy, almost desperate. I laughed nervously to myself. Probably some kid messing around. But as I turned to leave, I noticed the door. It was shut. I hadn't closed it. Locked in. I jiggled the handle, locked. From the inside. Which made no sense, because the school keys worked from either side. A cold chill crawled up my spine. I tried again, harder. Nothing. And then I heard it. A faint scraping sound, coming from the back of the classroom. Like fingernails dragging across wood. I spun around, shining my flashlight. The sound stopped. The beam landed on the tall wooden supply closet in the corner. The door was slightly ajar. My gut told me not to look. But curiosity got the better of me. I crept closer and nudged the door open with the end of my mop handle. Nothing. Just stacks of textbooks and a box of old maps. I let out a shaky laugh, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. But then, the closet door slammed shut in my face. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand. In the brief moment of darkness, I heard breathing. Slow, heavy, just a few feet away. When I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it back on, the closet door was standing wide open again. And the words on the chalkboard had changed. Now it said, "Too late." The hallway. The door behind me clicked unlocked. I didn't waste time. I bolted into the hallway, my footsteps echoing like gunshots. My heart was hammering in my chest. But the hallway, it wasn't right. The fluorescent lights above flickered, buzzing louder than I'd ever heard. The lockers seemed warped, stretched taller than normal, like funhouse mirrors. And the air was ice cold, even though the boiler should have been blasting heat. I forced myself to keep moving. Just get downstairs, I thought. Get out. But when I turned the corner, the hallway kept going. And going. And going. I knew this school inside and out. The hallway should have ended after about 20 feet, opening to the stairwell. But now it stretched endlessly into darkness. My breathing quickened. I broke into a jog, then a run. But no matter how far I went, the end never came. Then I saw something ahead. A figure. At first, I thought it was a student. But as my flashlight beam caught it, I realized it was wearing a janitor's uniform. Same color, same patch. And it was me. The doppelganger. I froze in place. The figure was standing perfectly still, maybe 50 feet away. The beam caught its face, my face, but wrong. The skin looked pale, waxy, like a mannequin version of me. Its eyes were pitch black. It tilted its head slowly, studying me. Who the hell are you?" I stammered, though my voice cracked. The thing opened its mouth, and in a perfect mimic of my voice, it whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Then it smiled, too wide, stretching ear to ear. I dropped my mop and ran. I didn't care where the hallway led anymore, I just ran. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I kept going. Finally, I saw a door. A real door. The red glow of an exit sign above it. I slammed through, tumbling down a stairwell. The air hit me warm again, the sound of the boiler humming nearby. Reality seemed to snap back into place. I didn't stop. I sprinted through the boiler room, past the rows of pipes, until I burst out into the parking lot. The night air was crisp, the stars normal, the school looming behind me like it always had. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking, until I got in my car and sped off. The aftermath. The next morning, I tried to tell my supervisor what happened. Left out some details, of course. I didn't want him thinking I was crazy. I just said I thought I saw someone in the building, maybe a break-in. He looked at me funny. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Room 214? That's been locked since last year. No one's used it since Grady died." I stared at him. "Died? What are you talking about?" He leaned back in his chair, like it was no big deal. "Heart attack. In his classroom. The kids found him slumped over his desk. Whole thing was tragic. Haven't had the heart to clean the room out yet." "Why?" I didn't answer. I just nodded, excused myself, and went home. But here's the thing. I drove past Brookwood High last week. Curiosity, I guess. And when I parked across the street, just staring at the dark windows, I saw movement. Second floor. Room 214. Someone was standing in the window. And I swear on my life, it was me. I thought quitting Brookwood High would save me from the nightmares, but it only made them worse. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale version of myself grinning in the dark. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced that if I moved even an inch, he would step closer. Eventually, the bills piled up, and I couldn't afford to stay unemployed. That's how I ended up taking another janitor job, this time at a large office building downtown called the Wilcox Center. I told myself this would be different. A fresh start. Bright lights, security guards, cameras everywhere. No creepy abandoned classrooms. No chance of seeing him. I was wrong. The Wilcox Center was a massive 12-story building with a basement level that stretched like a maze. Most of my duties were routine: clean restrooms, wipe down desks, vacuum the carpets. The top floors were fine, even boring, but the basement, God, the basement, was a different story. It housed the building's storage rooms, maintenance tunnels, and the old boiler system that had been running since the 70s. Even in the middle of summer, the air down there felt damp and cold, like walking into a cellar where something had been sealed away. The other janitors hated working down there. Some flat out refused. But me? I didn't have the luxury of picking and choosing my assignments. I needed the hours, and the basement jobs paid a little extra. So, of course, I said yes. The first few nights were uneventful, aside from the uneasy silence. I tried to convince myself the stories I'd overheard from the day staff were just office gossip, things like unexplained noises, lights flickering, or the occasional door slamming shut. The kind of junk people say to spook newcomers. But then came the night when I was asked to clean storage room B12. That's when everything spiraled. The room was tucked away in the farthest corner of the basement, down a narrow corridor lined with rusted pipes that hissed when you walked past. I remember pushing my cart slowly, each squeak of the wheels echoing like gunshots. When I found the door to B12, it looked wrong. The paint was peeling, the hinges rusted, and even the handle felt icy to the touch. The sign above it was missing half the letters, so it just read, "St. Rage." I laughed under my breath at the irony, but the sound died in my throat when I noticed the door wasn't locked. Every other storage room in that basement required a key. Not this one. When I stepped inside, the smell hit me first. Damp, like rotting wood mixed with something metallic, almost like blood. My flashlight beam revealed shelves stacked with boxes, some collapsed from years of neglect. Papers, broken chairs, old typewriters, even a stack of mannequin heads, leftovers from who knows what, were scattered across the floor. I tried to ignore the unease crawling over my skin and focused on my job. Sweep, mop, get out. That was the plan. Halfway through sweeping, I heard a noise. Faint, but unmistakable. A soft dragging sound, like someone moving a heavy object across concrete. I froze, holding my breath. The noise stopped. I told myself it was probably rats. Big city building, basement storage, made sense. But then it came again, closer this time, and accompanied by something worse, a low, steady breathing. "Hello?" My voice cracked in the silence. "Anyone down here?" Nothing. Just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I shined my flashlight toward the shelves. That's when I saw it. One of the mannequin heads had been moved. When I first entered, they were stacked neatly in a pile. Now one was sitting upright on a shelf, facing me. And I swear on everything holy, its eyes were following the beam of my flashlight. I dropped the broom, stumbling backward. The dragging sound came again, louder now, coming from the far corner of the room. I swung the flashlight in that direction, and nearly screamed. There was a figure crouched in the shadows, its outline just barely visible. It looked like a man, hunched low, hands pressed flat against the floor like an animal ready to pounce. My first thought was that it was a squatter, someone living in the basement. That would explain the breathing, the noises. I swallowed hard and raised my voice. "Look, I don't want trouble. I'll just leave, okay?" The figure didn't move. It just stayed crouched, head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if studying me. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief strobe of light, I saw its face, or what should have been a face. It looked like my own reflection again, pale and waxy, with those same black, empty eyes. "No," I whispered, backing toward the door. "Not here, not again." The lights above me snapped off completely. The basement plunged into darkness. My flashlight sputtered once, twice, then died. And in the pitch black, the sound of dragging grew louder, closer, accompanied by a whisper in my own voice. "You shouldn't have come here." I bolted for the door, fumbling with the handle. It wouldn't budge. My palms were slick with sweat as I yanked and twisted, praying for it to give way. Behind me, the breathing grew heavier, almost right against my neck. I felt the air shift, like something reaching for me. Then, just as I thought I was done for, the door burst open, and I stumbled into the hallway. The lights were back on. My flashlight flickered to life in my hand as if it had never died. I spun around, nothing. The room was empty, the mannequins stacked neatly, no sign of the figure. Even the smell was gone. I slammed the door shut and called it a night, though I didn't tell anyone what had happened. How could I? I barely believed it myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen him again. The double. The thing that had followed me from Brookwood High. The next week, I avoided the basement altogether. I traded shifts with other janitors, begged for assignments on the upper floors, anything to keep me away from B12. But of course, you can't dodge forever. One Friday night, my supervisor specifically assigned me to the basement, complaining that other workers were refusing to go down there. "You're tough," he said. "You can handle it." I didn't feel tough. I felt like a man being sent to the gallows. When I returned to that corridor, everything felt wrong again. The pipes groaned louder, the air thicker, like it was pushing down on me. This time, the door to B12 wasn't just unlocked, it was wide open, as though someone had been waiting for me. My gut screamed to turn around, but something inside me knew that if I kept running, this thing, whatever it was, would never stop. I had to face it. I stepped inside, flashlight trembling in my hand. The room was darker than before, though all the overhead lights were on. The shelves seemed taller, the shadows deeper, and the mannequins, God, the mannequins, were now lined along the walls, standing upright, all facing the door. Their plastic faces were cracked and smeared with grime, but their eyes looked almost human. And then I realized with horror that every single mannequin had my face. I backed into the center of the room, spinning in circles, my breathing ragged. The shelves creaked, the dragging sound began again, and from the darkness beyond the mannequins, something stepped forward. It was me. Or rather, the pale, smiling version of me, dressed in the same janitor's uniform, eyes black pits, grin stretched impossibly wide. He raised one hand slowly, pointing directly at me, and spoke in a perfect mimic of my voice. "You opened the door. Now you can't close it." I should have quit being a janitor after the Wilcox Center. Most people would have. After everything I saw down there, after realizing that thing, my double, my shadow, whatever the hell it is, wasn't going away, I should have run as far as I could from any place with long hallways and locked rooms. But life doesn't work that way. Rent was due, and my savings were gone. Every night I told myself I'd start over, maybe get a job in construction or delivery, anything else. But when a staffing agency offered me good money to take a night janitor position at St. Mary's Hospital, I couldn't say no. Hospitals are busy, I told myself. Brightly lit. People awake at all hours. Nothing like empty schools or basements. I thought I'd be safe. God, I was so wrong. St. Mary's was one of those sprawling, half-modern, half-decaying hospitals that had been renovated a dozen times over the years but never fully updated. Parts of it gleamed with fresh paint and flat-screen monitors, while other wings looked like they hadn't been touched since the 1960s. My job mostly kept me in the older sections, the ones used less often at night. Long, quiet corridors. Empty operating theaters. Storage closets lined with wheelchairs and gurneys that looked like they belonged in a museum. Still, it paid well, and for the first couple of nights, I convinced myself everything was fine. The first thing that unnerved me was the smell. Hospitals always smell sterile, that sharp chemical tang of disinfectant. But in the old north wing where I worked, it was different. Damp, moldy, and beneath it, something faintly metallic, like rust, or blood. I shrugged it off at first. Old pipes, I figured. Water damage. The building was ancient. But then the sound started. It began small, footsteps echoing in the hall when I was sure I was alone, faint whispers that vanished when I turned my head. I chalked it up to doctors or nurses making late rounds. But one night, while I was mopping an old operating room, I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was the squeak of wheels, like a gurney being rolled slowly across the floor. I froze, mop dripping water onto the tiles. The sound grew louder, closer, until I finally forced myself to look up. The room's glass observation window looked out into the hallway, and through it I saw a gurney rolling past. But no one was pushing it. It glided by smoothly, silently, except for the faint squeak of its wheels. And on it, God help me, lay a body covered with a white sheet. I stumbled back, knocking my bucket over, water splashing across the floor. When I blinked, the hallway was empty. No gurney. No sheet. Just the humming of the fluorescent lights. From then on, things escalated. Lights flickered constantly, especially when I walked by. Doors that I had locked would stand wide open minutes later. Elevators arrived on my floor without anyone calling them, doors sliding open to reveal nothing but empty space. Sometimes I'd smell something burning, sharp and acrid, though nothing in the hospital was on fire. But the worst was the North Wing's basement level. One night, my supervisor told me to take supplies down to the morgue storage, which was housed in that basement. I wanted to refuse. Every fiber of me screamed not to go. But he was already frustrated with me. I was jumpy, slow, distracted. If I refused, I'd lose the job. So I forced myself into the service elevator, clutching the supply cart, my stomach in knots. The ride down was slow. The lights inside the elevator flickered, then dimmed to a dull yellow glow. For a moment I thought it was going to stall. When the doors finally creaked open, the basement air hit me, damp, freezing, thick with that metallic tang again. The hallways down there were narrow, lined with peeling paint and old medical cabinets that looked ready to collapse. Every sound echoed, the squeak of my cart, the scuff of my shoes, the pounding of my heart. The morgue was at the far end. I pushed the cart toward it, refusing to look into the shadowy doorways I passed. But when I reached the morgue doors, I stopped dead. They were already open. Inside, the room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a single flickering bulb. Rows of steel drawers lined the walls. Some were labeled with tags. A few stood slightly ajar. The temperature dropped sharply as I stepped inside, my breath fogging in the air. I tried to tell myself just to drop the supplies and leave. Don't linger. Don't look. But then I heard it, the scrape of metal sliding. One of the drawers slid open on its own. I stood frozen as a pale hand flopped limply over the edge, fingers long and stiff. My chest tightened, and I staggered back, nearly tripping over the cart. The hand twitched. "No," I whispered. "This isn't real. This isn't." The sheet covering the body inside shifted, like something underneath was breathing. Slowly, the figure sat up, the sheet falling away to reveal a pale, waxy face. My face. I stumbled backward, slamming into another drawer. Its latch popped, and it slid open too, another body inside, another version of me, eyes black and empty. One by one, the drawers began to rattle, sliding open, spilling out pale, grinning doubles of myself. Their mouths opened in unison, whispering in a chorus of my own voice. "You let me out. You let us out." I ran. God, I ran harder than I ever had in my life, shoving the cart aside and sprinting out of the morgue. The whispers followed me, echoing in the hall, bouncing off the walls, multiplying. I could feel them behind me, hear the slap of bare feet on the concrete. I barreled into the elevator, mashing the button for the ground floor, praying for the doors to close. For a moment, I saw them, my doubles, rounding the corner, dozens of them, all smiling, all whispering, all reaching. And then the doors slammed shut. When I staggered out onto the ground floor, the hospital looked normal again. Bright lights, sterile air, nurses walking by with clipboards, not a trace of what I'd just seen. No one believed me when I said I felt sick and had to go home. No one noticed how pale I was, how badly I shook. But that night, when I finally collapsed into bed, I realized I hadn't escaped. I woke in the middle of the night to a noise in my apartment. At first, I thought it was just the pipes, or a neighbor moving furniture. But then I heard the whisper. My own voice, clear as day, from the corner of the room. "You can't run from yourself." When I turned my head, I saw him, sitting calmly in my chair, smiling. After what happened at St. Mary's, I promised myself I'd never take another night job again. I told myself I was finished with silent corridors, with the smell of disinfectant, with shadows that twisted into familiar shapes. But reality doesn't care about promises. Rent kept climbing, bills piled higher, and before long, desperation shoved me right back into the world I had sworn to avoid. This time, it wasn't a hospital or an office tower, it was a school again. The place was called Warren Elementary, a squat, brick building in a small Ohio town. On paper, it was supposed to be a safe, easy job. Just a little elementary school, nothing compared to Brookwood High where all of this started. The building was smaller, the halls shorter, the classrooms filled with brightly colored posters and stuffed animals left behind on desks. I figured there was no way it could be as terrifying as the others. Kids' laughter still seemed to echo faintly in the walls, like the place had too much innocence baked into its bones to ever turn dark. But innocence can rot. I know that now. I worked the late shift again, though this time it was only until 1 a.m. instead of the whole night. Most nights were uneventful at first, vacuuming the library, emptying the trash in the cafeteria, wiping down the tiny sinks in the kindergarten bathrooms. But there was one area that I began to dread, the West Wing. It wasn't even that big, just a short hallway with 5 classrooms and a door leading to the basement, but every time I went there, I felt a pressure in my chest, like the air itself was heavier. Even stranger, the lights would sometimes hum louder there, flickering in a rhythm almost like breathing. I told myself it was just faulty wiring. But deep down, I knew better. One night, while I was mopping outside room 5, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but it grew clearer with each passing second, children laughing. Not just one, but several. High-pitched giggles echoing down the hall. My heart dropped because I knew the school was empty. I was the only one there. The laughter stopped as suddenly as it started. Then came the sound of tiny footsteps pattering quickly across the floor inside room 5. Against every ounce of reason, I pushed the door open. The classroom was exactly as it should have been, rows of desks, colorful drawings on the walls, a bulletin board with construction paper turkeys pinned in neat lines. But at the back of the room, near the chalkboard, I saw something that didn't belong. Tiny handprints smeared across the board in white chalk, dozens of them, overlapping, layered, as if a crowd of children had pressed their palms there at once. I stood staring, trying to process it, when my mop clattered to the ground. The chalk handprints began to smear themselves, dragging downward slowly, leaving long streaks like fingers clawing. I backed out of the room and nearly tripped over my cart. I didn't even bother to pick up the mop. I just left. But the next night, I had to return. Same hallway, same room. And this time, the door to room 5 was already open. I told myself to just ignore it, to focus on the floors, the trash, the routine. But something drew me in. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the chalkboard was clean, too clean, wiped spotless. That's when I noticed a child's drawing taped to the wall that hadn't been there before. Crayon on construction paper. It showed a stick-figure janitor with a mop standing next to a row of smiling children. Only the children had no eyes, just black circles scribbled over their faces. And the janitor? He had my uniform, my build, even the same keyring clip to his belt. I ripped the drawing down and shoved it in the trash bag, telling myself kids just leave things behind all the time. Maybe I missed it before. But the moment I left the classroom, the sound of tiny footsteps followed me down the hall. No matter how fast I walked, they kept pace, quick, light, scampering, like a crowd of invisible children was following at my heels. When I turned, the hallway was empty. The worst night came a week later. The principal had asked me to clean out the basement storage. The moment he said it, my stomach dropped. Of course there was a basement. There's always a basement. I stalled as long as I could, cleaning every other part of the school before finally forcing myself toward the West Wing. The basement door groaned as I pulled it open, a gust of stale, cold air rushing out. I clicked on my flashlight and started down the steps. Each creak of the stairs echoed too long, as if the space below was larger than it should have been. When I reached the bottom, I realized why it felt so wrong. The basement didn't look like it belonged to an elementary school at all. The concrete walls were cracked, lined with rusted pipes that dripped foul-smelling water. Old desks and broken toys were stacked haphazardly in corners, covered in cobwebs. But what really unsettled me was the mural painted on the far wall. It was faded, almost erased by time, but I could still make it out. Children standing in a circle, holding hands. In the middle of the circle stood a tall figure with a mop. His face was missing, just a white blank where features should have been. I turned to leave, my pulse thundering, but I heard it then, the laughter again, louder now, filling the basement. It surrounded me, echoing from the walls, overlapping, rising higher and higher until it turned into screams. The shadows between the stacks of desks seemed to shift, and from them, shapes began to crawl. Small shapes, child-sized, moving on hands and knees, their heads jerking unnaturally, eyes wide and empty. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. Its beam caught on one of their faces, and I realized with horror that it was one of the eyeless children from the drawing. Dozens of them were pulling themselves out of the shadows, surrounding me. Their laughter had turned shrill, warped, like broken records skipping. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me, but as I did, I heard a voice cutting through the chaos. Not a child's voice. My own. You let them out. I froze at the top of the stairs, every hair on my body standing on end. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by silence so heavy it rang in my ears. Slowly, I turned back toward the basement door. And through the crack at the bottom, I saw a shadow. A tall figure standing perfectly still, holding a mop. I thought quitting Warren Elementary would save me. I thought leaving that cursed building behind, never setting foot in its halls again, would put an end to the sounds, the laughter, the shadows that whispered my name. But the thing about some places, the kind of places soaked with too much history, too much suffering, is that they don't let you leave. Not really. They follow you. They find ways to remind you that you're never free. The first week after I quit, I tried to rebuild a routine. Days felt almost normal, coffee in the morning, small errands, trying to sleep at night even though my body had grown used to long hours in the dark. For a while, the silence in my apartment felt like healing. But then, late one night, as I sat watching TV with the volume low, I heard it again. The sound I'd prayed I'd never hear outside the walls of that school. Tiny footsteps. Quick, light, skittering across my living room floor. My body froze, my breath caught halfway in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound. The room was empty. Nothing but the faint glow of the TV flickering across the furniture. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the room, quick little taps like shoes on tile, only I didn't own tile flooring. It was carpet. And still, the sound came, too sharp, too clear. I told myself I was tired, that it was my imagination. I turned the TV off and climbed into bed, but I couldn't shake the sense that something else had come home with me. Sleep was a lost cause. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the drawing from the school, the eyeless children, the stick-figure janitor smiling. And then I'd hear a faint giggle, as though one of them had crept right up to my ear. The second week, things got worse. One evening, when I opened the closet to grab my coat, my heart nearly stopped. My mop was leaning there, upright, damp as though it had just been used. The problem was, I hadn't brought my mop home. I'd left it leaning in the basement of Warren Elementary, the night I ran. I should have left it behind with the rest of that nightmare. I slammed the closet door shut, my hands shaking, and tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe I owned an old mop I'd forgotten about, tucked away years ago. But I couldn't ignore the smell, the faint, musty scent of the school's basement still clung to it. Like it had been waiting there, following me home. The nights that followed blurred into one long descent. Objects began shifting around my apartment. Chairs pulled slightly out from the table when I knew I'd pushed them in. My keys dangling from a hook that I hadn't touched. Even my bathroom mirror sometimes fogged up with tiny handprints, too small to belong to anyone I knew. But the breaking point came one night when I woke to a scraping sound outside my bedroom door. Slow, deliberate, like wood dragging across the floor. My chest tightened, every nerve in my body screaming to stay still. The sound stopped. Then came a knock, 3 soft raps. I lay there, paralyzed, barely breathing. My bedroom door creaked open an inch. The hallway beyond was pitch black. At first, I thought maybe the building was shifting, or maybe I had imagined it all. But then, the sound came again, footsteps, but not the quick, scampering ones of children. No. These were heavier. Slow. Weighted. Each step deliberate, echoing in the dark. Something tall was in my apartment. The air felt colder, thicker, pressing against my chest. I gripped the blanket, too afraid to even sit up. My eyes strained to adjust, and then I saw it. A shadow taller than the doorway itself, leaning slightly, as if its head brushed the ceiling. In one hand, it held something long, thin. A mop. The shadow didn't move closer, didn't speak. It just stood there, filling the doorway, its presence thick as smoke. Then, slowly, the mop handle scraped across the floor. Back and forth. Back and forth. Like it was cleaning. And then, as if mocking me, I heard my own voice. Not from my throat, but from the shadow. Time to finish the job. My blood turned to ice. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The shadow stepped forward, its edges flickering like smoke, and that's when I realized something horrifying. It wasn't casting the shadow. It was the shadow. It had no face, no body, just a silhouette with a mop, leaking darkness into my home. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I remember is waking on the floor with morning light spilling through the blinds. The mop was gone. My door was closed. But in the corner of the room, taped to the wall, was another drawing. This one showed my apartment, crudely sketched in crayon. A little bed, a little table. And me, stick figure again, lying flat with excess for eyes. The tall janitor shadow stood over me with its mop, smiling wider than ever. When the agency called and offered me a short-term gig at the old Granville Theater, I almost said no out of reflex. Old theaters have a habit of sitting at the crossroads of memory and rot, peeling velvet, proscenium arches that hide dust, and basements full of stage sets no one remembers. They also have a lot of locked doors and rooms that staff don't want bothered. That's why they hire night janitors, people who will go into the places the daylight crowd forgets. I told myself I needed the money, the gig was decent, and it was only for a month. A month of sweeping dust off the plush seats, of emptying the sticky candy wrappers, of making the bathrooms look livable for the morning ushers. I figured a month would be easy, a neat little pocket of routine before something else, something normal, came along. I told myself that and lied to the part of me that still saw the pale, smiling version of my face wherever I looked. I lied until the first night I found the keys. The Granville had been closed for renovations for years. Rumor in the break room was that the owner had died and the estate kept dragging its feet. Rumor had a way of settling into real things, locked boxes, moth-eaten curtains, and rooms that never felt quite empty. The night I started, the lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and stale popcorn, the ceiling lights buzzed like tired insects. Nothing alarming. I did my rounds, bathrooms, lobby, aisle seats, sweep under the stage where old props lay like fossilized memories. The first odd thing I noticed was a small metal cabinet tucked into a shadowed alcove beneath the balcony stairs. It was a janitor thing, keys, maybe supply hooks. When I opened it, expecting the usual tangle of forgotten screws and a dusty flashlight, I found a neat row of brass keys, each bent on a different little ring. Someone had labeled them with a tiny paintbrush: boiler, 84, storage, 91, dressing A, 77. The years looked like little tombstones. I laughed under my breath, not a good laugh, a nervous thing, because I was tired of places that kept the past like an anchor. I ran my finger along the labels until I found one that made me stop dead: Janitor, Brookwood, 2009. My mouth went dry. Brookwood. The name slid into me like an ice cube. I could feel the gooseflesh on my arms. Whoever had been janitor at the Granville once kept a key with the name of the high school I'd left in such a rush. I took the key in my hand like a relic. It was heavier than it looked, like something that had been turned in locks 1,000 times. I pinned it to my belt until it jingled loud as a confession. That night, while I was dusting the ornate balcony railings, I heard the faintest sound, a tune, off-key and half-memorized, a childhood melody that belonged to some puppet show or nursery rhyme. It seemed to come from below, from behind the stage drapery. I should have ignored it. I should have kept to the list the owner had emailed me: clean the lobby, mop the corridor, empty the garbage. But habit is a funny thing. Curiosity and the part of me that still carried the other nights pulled me toward the sound. I ducked under the red curtain, flashlight slicing through the dark, and found a door I hadn't noticed on the stage left wall, a service entrance, small and unremarkable. It bore a brass tag with scarred letters: "Maintenance, keep out." The key in my pocket hummed against my jeans like an insect. I felt foolishly compelled to try it. The lock turned with a sigh, the door giving like an old bone. I stepped into a corridor that didn't map to the theater's tidy floor plan. It narrowed as I went on and the lights dimmed until my flashlight was doing most of the work. The walls were lined with photos pinned and thumbtacked in chaotic rows, black and white headshots, teen photos, faces smiling into the camera. Actors, stagehands, ushers. And then I noticed a pattern. Down the center of the wall, separated from the rest, were rows and rows of photographs of janitors. Men and women in different shades of blue and gray, mop in hand, each with a small plaque beneath: name, workplace, year. I moved closer, my breath fogging in the stale air. The first plaque read George P. Harlow, Granville, 1951. Beneath it, Charlotte Mills, ORPHEUM, 1963. I touched the glass of one frame, and my fingers trembled when I found my own face staring back at me. Not a painting, not a look-alike, my face, younger and softer perhaps, pinned beneath a plaque that read, John Rivers, Brookwood High, 2009. I didn't remember having my photograph taken for any kind of memorial. I didn't remember being honored anywhere. I fumbled for the key, my hands shaking, and when I looked further down the wall my heart tripled its pace. My face again, under another plaque. Same eyes, same mole on the left cheek, different year, different school. John Rivers, Wilcox Center, 2011. John Rivers, St. Mary's, 2013. The wall went on, every decade claiming the same face in different uniforms. I could feel the air constricting. The safe, rational part of me tried to speak, to call out, but my voice felt like a swallowed thing. The photos weren't arranged chronologically. They were arranged like a map, a chain. Each plaque had a small brass key hanging beneath it on a hook, and the key's tag matched the label in the cabinet I'd found earlier. I reached out like someone possessed and touched one of those keys. It was the Brookwood key. Cold as a coin. When my skin brushed it, the lights above me flickered and a whisper threaded itself through the corridor, my whisper, but as if played back through something older than memory. "You left the door open," it said, soft and accusing. I yanked my hand away and stumbled back, almost knocking into a rack of old program flyers that cascaded to the floor like falling leaves. A new sound joined the whisper then, a scraping, as though something were being drawn along concrete. I turned reflexively and saw at the far end of the corridor a small door ajar. Behind it lay a room that looked like a shrine. Dozens of mops stood upright in a circle, handles converging like a crown. In the center, a bucket sat like a basin, water dull and still, and floating on top of it were chipped, paper-cut dolls with blank faces. Around the rim of the basin, names had been scratched into the metal. One name was fresh: John Rivers, Granville, 2025. My tongue went dry. The date looked like ink that had bled only hours ago. I wanted to leave. Every logical bone in my body begged me to walk out the way I had come and never come back. But something moved in my chest, equal parts compulsion and recognition. I stepped into the room, the wooden floorboards creaking underfoot, and the mops seemed to breathe together, a whisper of bristles. There was a mirror on the wall opposite the basin, tall and old, its frame carved with gilded leaves. I hadn't intended to look at it, because mirrors had become to me what open doors had been, thresholds. But when I met my reflection, it didn't smile. My reflection was already smiling. Not a thin echo of me, but the same wide, waxy grin I had seen in school hallways and hospital corridors. The reflection cocked its head and lifted its hand, mimicking me, as if I were puppet. When I blinked, the reflection did not. Behind me the whisper swelled into a chorus, tiny, excited, like children. I read the names around the basin again and realized with a certainty that made my stomach drop that the list wasn't just names. They were dates of hire, dates of departure. Some were scratched out. Others had a simple notation, returned. My name, fresh on the metal like a fresh grave, had the single, neat word beneath it, active. The chorus of whispers turned into a chant. Clean it. Close it. Clean it. Close it. I felt a pressure at my temples and something ancient and patient fold into me, a knowledge not mine but chained to me like a key in a lock. I understood then that the openings I'd blamed on forgetfulness were deliberate, they required tending. The mops needed to move. The buckets needed refilling in certain basements. Each act of cleaning was not a mundane task but a ritual, and I was the vessel compelled to perform it. The last thing I remember before the world went liquid was the reflection smiling wider, and in my own voice, my mouth moving without the rest of me, saying, "Thank you for letting us in." When I woke, I was on the stage of the Granville, hands dirted as if I'd been scrubbing a floor for hours. The lights were on, the house empty, and my keyring held a new edition, a tiny brass key labeled Granville, 2025. On the theater wall, beneath the rows of Janitor photos, someone had added a new frame, fresh and warm to the touch. Inside, my face stared out with the same uncanny familiarity, and beneath it a plaque had been engraved and pinned into place, John Rivers, Granville, 2025. I pressed my palm to the glass and for the first time, the face behind it smiled back from a place that felt like home. After I found the obituary and the note that carried my own handwriting, 3 words I didn't remember writing, "Keep the doors," I thought the madness had reached its limit. I told myself that if I could just ignore it, if I could force myself back into a routine, the nightmare would dry up like a dream does in daylight. But the problem was, the more I tried to forget, the more the world reminded me that forgetting wasn't an option. Every time I passed a storefront window, I half expected the reflection to grin back at me. Every time I walked down my apartment hallway, I swore I heard the squeak of a mop bucket well behind me. It was as though something had turned my entire life into a stage, and I was just another janitor waiting for his cue. One night, maybe 2 weeks after the Granville incident, I couldn't sleep. The noise of the city outside my window felt muffled, drowned beneath something heavier. My dreams had been full of water, of black pails filling themselves in rooms I'd never entered. I finally gave up, pulled on a hoodie, and started pacing. That's when I noticed something impossible, a door where no door had ever been. It was in my apartment hallway, between my bathroom and bedroom. At first, I thought maybe I was half asleep, hallucinating, but no, the brass doorknob was cool beneath my palm. The wood smelled faintly of mildew and lemon polish, the scent I had learned to dread. My stomach turned as I realized what I was looking at, a janitor's closet. One that had never been there before. For minutes, maybe longer, I just stood and stared at it, too afraid to open it but too terrified to look away. I finally whispered into the empty air, "What do you want from me?" My voice trembled, cracked. That's when I heard it, the soft sound of something dripping. Steady. Rhythmic. Coming from behind the door. Against every instinct, I turned the knob. The door swung inward without resistance, and the first thing that hit me was the smell, damp concrete, rust, and that faint sour-sweet stench of old water left too long in a bucket. My apartment shouldn't have had space for this. It was just supposed to be drywall and wiring. But instead, beyond the threshold stretched a long, narrow corridor. Pale green paint peeled from the walls, and fluorescent lights buzzed weakly overhead. I stepped inside, my hand dragging against the wall to anchor me, and the door closed behind me with a click. Panic rose in my chest. I spun back to open it again, but the door had vanished, replaced with more endless wall. I was trapped. I told myself to breathe, to move forward, because standing still meant letting the fear eat me alive. My sneakers echoed against the tile floor as I followed the dripping sound, deeper into the corridor. The walls began to change as I went. At first, just water stains, brown blooms stretching toward the ceiling. But then, handprints began appearing, tiny, faint, dozens of them smeared along the paint like children had dragged their palms across the walls. They grew darker the further I went, until they weren't stains at all but impressions, the plaster itself warped into shallow, reaching hands. I walked faster, nearly jogging, until I reached the end. A single door waited there, labeled with a tarnished brass plate, Janitor's Room. I swallowed hard and tried the handle. It turned easily, opening onto a cavernous space that stole the air from my lungs. It wasn't a closet. It was an auditorium-sized room lined with rows of shelves. And on those shelves sat dozens, maybe hundreds, of glass jars. Inside each jar floated murky water, and suspended in that water were objects, old name tags, rusted key rings, scraps of uniforms, even yellowed photographs. I walked the aisles in a daze, my flashlight trembling in my grip. Each jar was labeled with a year and a place: Warren Elementary, 1978. St. Mary's Hospital, 1989. Brookwood High, 2009. My chest tightened. My name hung in the air before I even reached it. And when I did, when my eyes landed on the jar with the neat black lettering, John Rivers, Granville Theater, 2025, I nearly dropped the light. Inside the jar floated a photograph of me. Not an old one, not something I could excuse away. It was the photo I had taken for my driver's license just last year. Same shirt, same grimace. But the eyes in the picture weren't mine anymore. They were glassy, lifeless, staring into nothing. My breathing turned ragged, desperate. I reached out without thinking and wrapped my fingers around the jar. The water inside shivered violently, sloshing against the glass. And then, without warning, every single jar on every single shelf began to rattle in unison. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 muffled screams. Water splashed against the insides, and in some of them I thought I saw faces pressing outward, mouths open in silent wails. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. It rolled across the floor, beam spinning wildly until it caught on something in the corner of the room, a figure. At first, I thought it was another janitor mannequin, like some bizarre display. But then it moved. Slowly. Deliberately. A tall shadow unspooled itself from the corner, mop handle dragging against the tiles. Its head brushed the ceiling, its body swaying as though barely tethered to gravity. It stepped into the light, and though its face was nothing but shifting darkness, I knew it was smiling. The jars rattled louder, like applause. I wanted to run. Every muscle screamed at me to run. But my feet wouldn't move. The figure raised its mop and pointed it at me like a conductor cueing an orchestra. And all around me, the jars burst, one by one, showering the room with water and fragments of glass. The shelves toppled, the sound a thunderous roar, and I collapsed to my knees in the flood. I thought I would drown there, buried under other people's memories, crushed by the weight of all the janitors who had come before me. And then, just as suddenly, silence. The water was gone. The jars were gone. I was kneeling on the floor of my apartment, my hand pressed against the carpet. The door between my bathroom and bedroom had vanished, leaving nothing but the blank white wall that had always been there. For a moment, I almost convinced myself it had all been a hallucination, some elaborate dream. But when I opened my palm, cuts from shattered glass laced across my skin, and in the center lay a single brass key. Its tag read, Janitor, Room, Infinity. I used to think nightmares were dreams that ended when you woke up. But the truth is, some nightmares keep going, whether your eyes are closed or open. They become your air, your walls, the very rhythm of your heartbeat. For weeks now, I've been living in one. And tonight, as I sit here with this brass key in front of me, the one with the symbol infinity etched into its tag, I know I've finally reached the last shift. The final corridor. The end, or whatever waits beyond it. The knocking has grown louder every night. At first, it was just faint taps, like knuckles against hollow drywall. Then it became heavier, like fists pounding from the other side. Now it's everywhere. My apartment is alive with it, the floorboards thudding beneath my feet, the walls trembling as though hundreds of hands are begging to be let through. The whispers never stop, either. They don't even bother hiding anymore. They rise in chorus around me whenever I close my eyes, chanting in voices that sometimes sound like mine. Keep the doors. Keep the doors. Keep the doors. I haven't slept in 3 days. I tried leaving once, packing a bag and running for the stairwell, but every door in my building was locked. Not jammed. Locked. The stairwell door, the fire escape hatch, even the elevator doors wouldn't open. And yet, my apartment door, the one that should have let me out into the hall, opened onto the same corridor from the Granville Theater. The same flickering fluorescent lights, the same endless stretch of peeling green walls. I slammed it shut, heart pounding so hard I nearly fainted, and when I opened it again, it was just my apartment hallway. But I knew then, I was already trapped. The key appeared heavier by the day. Sometimes, when I touched it, I swore I could feel it pulse like a heartbeat. And in those moments, I knew what it wanted. Keys are made for locks, after all. And I had one left to open. It happened tonight. The knocking grew so violent that picture frames rattled off my walls, cups slid across the counter, and dust rained from the ceiling. Then came the sound of water. Slow at first, dripping in corners, then rushing. My carpet darkened as though a flood was rising from beneath, and the air filled with the sour stink of mop water, mold, and something faintly metallic. I grabbed the key, because I knew if I didn't, I'd drown where I stood. The door appeared again between my bedroom and bathroom, but this time it wasn't just wood. It was a massive, industrial-looking thing, rusted metal with bolts lining the edges, like it had been stolen from a boiler room or a bunker. A small plate was welded to the center. It didn't say janitor's room anymore. It said one word, infinity. The key in my hand vibrated as I approached. My fingers trembled so badly I nearly dropped it, but when I slid it into the lock, it turned like it had been waiting for me all along. The door swung open, and cold air rushed past, smelling of stone and stagnant water. I stepped through. The space beyond was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't a corridor. It wasn't a closet. It was endless. Imagine a warehouse so vast you can't see the far wall, only rows upon rows of doors stretching into darkness. Thousands of them, each one different. Some wooden, some metal, some rotting, some freshly painted. Apartment doors, classroom doors, stage doors, hospital ward doors. And each one had a tag nailed above it, stamped with names and years. I saw Brookwood High, 2009. Warren Elementary, 1978. St. Mary's Hospital, 1989. Granville Theater, 2025. The air vibrated with whispers. No, not whispers, instructions. The chant I'd been hearing for weeks was louder now, layered with voices that overlapped until my skull buzzed with the weight of them. Keep the doors. Close them. Clean them. Keep the doors. I walked, my footsteps echoing in the vastness, until I reached a door I recognized instantly. My childhood bedroom. The same pale blue paint, the same scratches near the knob where I'd carved initials when I was 7. The tag above it read, John Rivers, 1998. My stomach turned. I touched the knob, and the door swung open to reveal the room exactly as it had been when I was a child. Same posters on the wall, same toys on the shelf. But the bed was occupied. A boy sat there, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the floor. His hair was messy, his face pale. He looked up, and I nearly collapsed. It was me. Not like the reflections, not like the photographs. This was me, 10 years old, with tears in his eyes. He whispered, "You were supposed to keep it shut." His voice shook. "You left it open, and now they're all here." The boy me reached under the bed and pulled out a small notebook. I recognized it instantly. I used to keep it hidden there, filled with childish drawings and secret thoughts. He handed it to me, his hands trembling. I opened it, and my heart dropped. The pages weren't full of doodles anymore. They were filled with names. Endless names, dates, and places, scrawled in my own handwriting. Janitors, schools, theaters, hospitals. The same list I'd seen on the plaques and jars. Why me? I asked, voice cracking. The boy's expression twisted into something that wasn't innocence anymore. His smile stretched wide, too wide, until it was the same grin I'd seen on my reflection, on the shadow, on every version of myself that haunted me. He leaned close and whispered, "Because you always were. There was never anyone else. You're the door." The walls around us groaned, and the room dissolved into darkness. Suddenly I wasn't standing in front of one door anymore, I was in the center of all of them. Thousands of doors shook violently on their hinges, slamming open and shut. From each one spilled laughter, screams, dripping water, the scrape of mops. Shadows poured out, tall and thin, each carrying a mop handle like a weapon. They converged on me, surrounding me, whispering my name in 100 different tones. I clutched the key. It burned hot in my hand, so hot it seared my skin, but I couldn't let it go. I knew then what the choice was. Either I took my place, or I let the doors stay open forever. The tallest shadow stepped forward, its grin splitting the darkness. It pressed a mop into my free hand and whispered in my own voice, "Time to finish the job." And in that moment, I understood. All the janitors, all the faces, all the names, they weren't different people. They were me. Over and over. Different times, different places, but always the same soul, recycled, returned. I hadn't inherited the job. I was the job. I had been cleaning, closing, keeping the doors across decades, maybe centuries. And now the cycle had come back around. The voices screamed in unison, "Keep the doors! Keep the doors!" I raised the mop. The darkness folded inward, swallowing me whole. Final twist ending of part 8. If you're hearing this now, it means I failed. Or maybe it means I succeeded. I don't know anymore. Because when I woke up, it wasn't in my apartment. It wasn't even in my own body. I was standing in a school hallway I didn't recognize. The air smelled faintly of chalk and bleach. Children's drawings lined the walls. In my hands was a mop, damp and heavy. On my chest, stitched into the uniform I was suddenly wearing, was a new name tag. Janitor. And above it, the name wasn't John Rivers anymore. It was yours.